But let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's talk about respiratory protection. When we talk about respiratory protection, we're talking about PPE designed to protect workers from airborne inhalation hazards. These types of protection, or this type of protection, is used when engineering controls are not adequate. We've spent the last 2 units talking about engineering controls: local exhaust ventilation, dilution ventilation, and general ventilation. When those controls are not getting the job done for whatever reason, the last resort is respiratory protection. And you could also implement some administrative controls, but generally when your engineering controls don't work, you're going to use personal protective equipment to protect your lungs, to protect yourself from those airborne inhalation hazards. Now, there are also some OSHA regulations that require the use of engineering controls and PPE. Silica would be an example. There are some operations where silica is generated. In those operations, you have to have the engineering controls in place, but the workers still have to wear respiratory protection. And the goal of this program of respiratory protection is to protect workers from contaminants, and also to make sure workers have the level of oxygen they need in their work area. The types of hazards, specifically dusts, fumes, mists, gases, vapors, smoke, and then also protect from oxygen deficiency. Now this may all look like the same to you. What's the difference? Technically, from a chemistry standpoint, dust is different than a fume. Dust is the result of grinding, crushing, or drilling. Fumes occur when a material is heated and it gives off fumes. Mists, small liquid particles. Gases, substances in a gaseous state at normal temperatures and pressures. But I don't need to read through the entire list. But the purpose of PPE is to protect workers from these hazards when the ventilation systems are not able to do it. One of the OSHA requirements that employers must comply with: when workers are required to wear respirators, the employer must have a respiratory protection program, a written respiratory protection program. That's not optional. If you have workers wearing a respirator, that company has to have a written program. The written program needs to cover site-specific procedures that are used, exposure assessment, or some method to determine what the level of exposure is for the workers. It needs to cover the selection procedure, how different types of respiratory protection are going to be selected. Medical evaluation. If a worker is required to wear a respirator, they have to be evaluated from a medical standpoint before they can wear that respirator. Wearing a respirator could be very dangerous to some people with certain medical conditions, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. The respiratory protection program needs to cover fit testing. It needs to cover worker training, how the worker is trained, and how they are taught to use the protection devices. It needs to have a section on maintenance and inspection of respirators. I mean, there's a lot. Again, that's just a partial listing of what needs to be covered in a written respiratory protection program. To give you a better idea of what's involved, I'm going to go ahead and show you a sample respiratory protection program. I'm not going to go into detail. I'm not going to read every word to you, but this was our respiratory protection program that we had at Manhattan Road and Bridge. We have the purpose, the scope, who's responsible, references that are used for this document, in this document. And notice, even though we're in the construction industry, Some general industry standards are applicable for some construction operations. It's not just 1926 regulations, but also 1910 when it comes to respiratory protection. 1910-134. Construction companies have to comply with that. Any business, any company that is using respirators, they have to comply with 1910-134. This program, it's like 8 pages long. General requirements. Project superintendent and project manager must develop a site-specific plan for their job site. That was one of the specific requirements on our jobs. Medical evaluations and fit testing must be performed on each employee. Emphasis on finding the engineering controls wherever possible. That's always your first step. You want to implement an engineering control if possible. There's a section talking about possible engineering controls. And here's a specific section referring to engineering controls. When effective engineering controls are not feasible, MRB will institute a task-specific respiratory program to which, there's a typo in there, which will be suitable to protect employees from a harmful atmosphere. Respirators will be provided to all MRB personnel who are required to enter the controlled area. Entrance will be limited to only specific people. And that's just a sample of the wording, the terminology that you're going to find in one of these respiratory protection programs. Yeah, this must have been my rough draft of this program here, because usually I go over something 8 or 10 times to find the typos before I'm finished with it. So yeah, 6th of March 2007, this would have been a rough draft. There was a new version of this that came out in 2011. So this is an older example. But it has the same components. It gives you an idea of what needs to be involved in a written respiratory protection program. And most of you guys are going to go to work for companies where this is already in place. But some of you may end up in a company that doesn't have any of this. And if you want to get your company into compliance, this may be something you have to create. If you do have to create a respiratory protection program, you could use something like this as your template and just change it to fit your company. Now, many of you have a copy of this. If you were in my construction management class last summer, I gave you a flash drive. This document is on that flash drive. And you could take the document and you can make changes as to suit your company. Another requirement, area requiring the use of respiratory protection will be clearly identified with signage and separated from other work by required barrier and or isolation and air monitoring. Again, site-specific is very important. In the construction industry, you go from one job to the next, everything starts all over again. You've got to have a site-specific plan for each individual site. You can't just develop one plan that's going to apply to all the different sites. You've got to have site-specific safety plans, including respiratory protection plans at each site. As far as respirator selection, at MRB, it was the responsibility of the division safety engineer to select respiratory equipment. That's going to be your responsibility in a lot of situations. Now here's an identification of different hazards and the types of respirators that you would need. Generally speaking, there are 2 types of respirators, and we'll get into this, but there's positive pressure that blows air toward and away from the wearer. Then there's negative pressure, which is generally a passive device where air is sucked through the filter and it's cleaned as it's inhaled through the filter. But we'll get more into all of this as we move along. Here's information about the medical evaluations. Prior to using a respirator, the employee will be required to be medically evaluated by a professional licensed healthcare provider. The healthcare provider will administer the required OSHA respirator questionnaire. This can be completed and tracked at no charge online with 3M. We use 3M for our respirators. Upon completion of the questionnaire, if needed, a pulmonary function test, a respirator physical, and x-rays may be administered at no cost to the employee. If the employee is fit to wear a respirator, a status report is generated and is kept on file at the site. Again, this is because of what I said earlier. Not everyone is healthy enough to wear a respirator. And I'll go ahead and mention why that's the case. In most cases, if people have a lung condition or a heart condition, they may not be able to wear a respirator because a respirator will actually interfere with oxygen intake. It can cut the oxygen that you're getting into your lungs anywhere from 5% to 20%. And some health conditions you're not going to be able to handle that restriction in oxygen flow into your lungs. So you got to be medically evaluated before wearing a respirator. Then we have fit test procedures, and we'll go through this in some detail. The different fit test procedures that need to be followed. Then with quantitative fit test, qualitative fit test, we'll talk about both of those. Positive and negative face fit check. This is all part of fit testing here. Storage and cleaning and disinfecting needs to be included in your program also. How are you going to store the respirators? How are they going to be cleaned and disinfected after use so they're ready for the next use? Here's some of the documentation that goes along with the site-specific plan. Here's some additional appendices. Fit test procedures, more on fit test, respiratory protection program, documentation. This has to do with voluntary use. If an employee, now there may be situations, and this is important, let me slow down here a little bit. There may be situations where a respirator is not required, but the worker wants to wear a respirator. If they choose to wear a respirator in a situation where it's not required, then they have to sign off on this. If they're choosing to wear a respirator where it's not required, where it's not mandatory, then the company doesn't have to do all the medical evaluation, all that stuff. They don't have to jump through all those hoops. But we do need a signature from the employee. When they sign this, they're acknowledging that they're wearing this on a voluntary basis and they're not holding the company liable. Here's some more information for employees using respirators. Okay. And again, that's a look at a sample respiratory protection program, which again is required by OSHA if employees are required to wear respirators. Now let's talk about some respirator types. We've got air purifying respirators. These have filters to remove contaminants from inhaled air. And there are several different variations, and we'll look at some of these different variations as we continue our discussion as we move on in this unit. Another type of respirator is the atmosphere supplying or air supplying respirator. This provides a supply of clean air to the worker, and there are different types of this particular category as well, and we'll look in more detail at them as we move along. Okay, more information on air purifying respirators. Purifies air containing particulate matter, dusts, mists, gases, vapors. It must have the correct filter for the contaminants. Different contaminants require different filters, and we'll take a closer look at that also in this unit. An air purifying respirator can be a half face or a full face. respirator. You used to see quarter face respirators that basically just covered the mouth and the nose, but those are not common any longer. I don't even know if anybody sells those anymore. If someone's wearing a quarter face respirator, it's probably an old one that they had in the closet somewhere, and it may, if it's that old, it may not be suitable for use. Most of the air purifying respirators are going to be the half face respirators. With these types of respirators, the filter attaches to the face piece. Most of them are going to be passive, but some of them may be powered by a pump. And the filter cartridge that's selected is most important. The filter must match the contaminant. An important point about matching a filter to the contaminant. Particulate filters and gas or vapor filters are not interchangeable. Ensure that you have the right type of filter for the contaminant. And here's a closer look at a half mask passive air purifying respirator. Again, this is an air purifying respirator. Air purifying respirator. You have your filter cartridge that attaches to the body of the respirator. Again, this part is considered the face piece or the body. You have straps or headbands that allow you to cinch it down tight to your head and face. You're going to have they don't have it labeled, but you'll have one that goes around the back of your neck. There's going to be two inlets where these filter cartridges go. You'll have a filter cartridge on this side and then a filter cartridge on this side. And it could be a particulate filter like we have here, or a gas vapor cartridge like we have here. Again, that's the typical half mask passive respirator. Again, we will talk more about it, some of the different filter cartridges available. This part I didn't mention, this is the exhalation valve. As you inhale, the air enters the mask through the filters, and as you exhale, it is exhaled through this exhalation valve. Normally going to be located in this area between the two filter cartridges. Again, this is a half mask passive respirator. And these respirators will generally be able to support a wide variety of cartridges for any type of contaminant. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you buy one brand of face piece, say the body of your respirator is, MSA is a popular brand. If you buy an MSA face piece or body, you're also going to need MSA cartridges. The cartridges are not normally interchangeable between manufacturers. The next slide, here are some examples of some different air purifying respirators. Up at the top, we have the full mask or the full face. We have the cartridges on the sides, exhalation valve right there in front. With this type of air purifying respirator, everything from the top of your hairline down to around your chin is covered. This area here, can't see it very well, but that's a clear shield. No gas should be able to get to your eyes. No gas should be able to get to your face anywhere. That's assuming that you have a good tight seal around your face. And that's where fit testing comes in. Then we have a conventional half mask. This is a P100 level particulate filter right here. That is the type of cartridge that I've been wearing when I go out into public recently. I've got a half mask respirator like this, and I've got a P100 filter on it. P100 means that they will capture 99.97% of the particles down to a size of 0.03 microns. Now, actually, 0.3 microns. 0.3 microns. That's the same efficiency of a HEPA filter. So basically, you're wearing a HEPA filter on your face when you wear a P100 cartridge. There's been a lot of talk in the news about P95. The P95s really aren't going to keep the virus out. It's not going to keep all the microorganisms out. It may capture some of them, but the P95, and we'll talk more about this, but the P95 is only 95% efficient. And as we saw in the last unit, many viruses are smaller than 0.3 micron. I think it's safe to say that most viruses are smaller than 0.3 micron. Now, again, it's a good precaution during this pandemic to wear a respirator, but social distancing is still probably going to be your most important protection, and not going into areas where there are people who may be infected, because a respirator gives some protection, but it's not foolproof protection. Even if you're wearing a P100 level, like the pink one here, or the magenta colored one, that's only 99.97% at 0.3 microns, and many viruses are smaller than 0.3 microns. Now, I just wrote all over that, but anyhow, I'll read it to you so you can know what it says. This is a vapor cartridge attached to this half-mask respirator, and the yellow label, we'll talk more about all the different color coding. The yellow label indicates that it's good for organic vapors, and acid gases. So if you're going to be working in an area where we have the presence of organic vapors like toluene or acetone or something like that, you need a cartridge that will protect you from organic vapors. If you're in an area where there are acid gases, you need a cartridge that will protect you from that. This particular cartridge is rated for both organic vapors and acid gases. All right, on that note, I'm going to go ahead and end this module here. We're about 30 minutes in. When we come back, we'll talk more about the different ratings for dust masks and other filtering face pieces, other types of air purifying respirators.